loves, welcome to my channel. So today we're looking into an ice cold case from 1922. This case happened in World War I era Germany on the HINTERKEIFEK farm. For this one, you really have to pay close attention. This is not one to skip at any point because you could easily get lost or confused. So let's get into it. HINTERKEIFEK was owned by Cecilia, who had inherited it at age 35 after her first husband passed away in 1885. It is not clear how he passed away, but before he passed, they had 2 children together. The farm was built in 1863. The very next year, after her husband's demise, she married 27-year-old Andreas Gruber, an 8 years younger man who worked on the property for her as a farmhand. Andreas was said to be a socially awkward and withdrawn individual, but he was quite helpful and very involved in the day-to-day running of the HINTERKEIFEK property. Together, he and Cecilia had 3 daughters, but they lost 2 of these daughters at infancy, except one, whom they named Victoria. So Cecilia and Andreas' family, which we are now going to be referring to as the Grubers, were quite private. They were a very private family. They hardly or rarely interacted or associated with neighbors and other families in the village as a whole. Not that they had close neighbors anyways, their closest neighbor was a distance away because of the rural setting of the property. That initial time, there were rumors and gossips that Andreas beat his wife Cecilia at every little provocation. It was said that he physically abused and tortured his family. In fact, so much that the deceased children were presumed to have passed away from abuse, mistreatment, starvation, and neglect. The gossip didn't stop there. It was also said that Andreas Gruber was having an incestuous relationship with his then teenage daughter Victoria. Though there was no concrete evidence to back this up at the time, but if this was true, something would have been done about it because incest was frowned upon. And just like they say that there is no smoke without fire, when Victoria turned 16, she confided in a neighbor that her father had been forcing himself from her from time to time and she could no longer take it. She couldn't bear the sight of Andreas anymore as it disgusted her because of what he was doing to her. Now, I don't know if Cecilia was aware that this had been going on, because if she did, she didn't do anything to stop it or even report to the authorities. So Cecilia's 2 children from her previous marriage were now grown and eventually they moved out of HINTERKEIFEK. The only person left out of the children was now Victoria. Victoria immersed herself into the HINTERKEIFEK farm, taking care of the animals, feeding them. She was just carrying out her own share of labor and contributing to the daily running of the household. She had, of course, grown into this beautiful, tall, slim, and attractive young lady by this time. She wasn't like other members of her family though. Her family usually avoided contact with other people, but Victoria, she was a very social and interactive person. She was easygoing. She even joined the local church choir and she would quickly become a leading member of the choir because of how sweet her voice was and her demeanor, as well as her commitment, and she would attend mass every Sunday without missing any service. So by the time Victoria had turned 27, she met a young man named Carl Gabriel. I am not sure where or how they met. I couldn't find that information, but with time they got engaged and the pair got married in April of 1914. Now, after they were married, Victoria, who was now the heir to HINTERKEIFEK property, was granted the deed to the HINTERKEIFEK property. So she and her husband Carl will now live on the farm full time. But of course, her father and mother, Andreas and Cecilia, remained living at the property with them too. And this would make married life a living hell for both Victoria and Carl. Andreas, for whatever reasons, didn't like Carl for Victoria, and he didn't hesitate to show his hatred and his disapproval every opportunity he got. Carl even complained to his friends and his family that his father-in-law Andreas bullied and tormented him a lot. He would sometimes, according to Carl, deprive him of meals, and other times he would just give him passive-aggressive behavior. Carl, at a point, only after a few weeks into the marriage, returned back to his parents' home because of Andrea's behavior towards him. But his folks asked him to go back and try to make the marriage work since he really loved his wife Victoria. Besides, she was the heir to the Grubers, and HINTERKEIFEK would eventually belong to the Gabriels after they had had children. So Carl obliged and returned to HINTERKEIFEK. About 4 months into their marriage, Carl enlisted into the army. Like I said earlier in the beginning, this was during World War I. By this time, Victoria was pregnant and Carl was sent to fight in France. Carl did not make it back alive from combat, as he was said to be killed in action in Arras, France, by a shell attack in December of 1914, just a couple of months after he had gone to fight. Victoria then gave birth to a baby girl whom she named Cecilia, and they called her Zilly for short. So since Victoria now had a child with Carl, HINTERKEIFEK now was passed to the Gabriel's family. But since Carl was deceased, his share of the property was shared between his widow Victoria and little Zilly. So 3/4 of the property was passed to Zilly, but Victoria was in charge of the chunk. So she became the owner of HINTERKEIFEK because Zilly was too small. About 6 months after Carl passed, Victoria and her father Andreas were convicted of having an incestuous relationship. The charges were related to crimes occurring between 1907 and 1910, when Andreas was in his early 50s and when Victoria had just turned 20 years old. I am not sure if when this was happening she was exactly 20, but report says that she was in her early 20s. Remember, there had been rumors and gossip all along when she was a teenager, so local authorities got both her and Andreas arrested for their incestuous relationship, and Victoria received a 1-month jail sentence, while Andreas received a 1-year jail sentence. When each of them finished serving their sentences, they both returned to the same HINTERKEIFEK farm. This was way back in early 1900s. I don't know what they were thinking, sentencing this girl who had been a victim of her father to a whole month in jail. How was this even her fault? The fact that both the abuser and the victim were still allowed back into the same house, well, I guess it was a different day and time and a different way of thinking back then. So in September of 1919, this was now about 5 years since Carl's demise, Victoria gave birth to her second child, whom she named Joseph. The old rumors and gossips raised its ugly head again, and people said that Joseph was a product of Victoria and her father's incestuous relationship. But on the child's birth certificate, Victoria listed the initials of her child's father as LS. These initials could have been those of the Gruber's 45-year-old neighbor, Lawrence Schlittenbauer, with whom Victoria had had a relationship about a year prior. But since she didn't come out to boldly say, "Oh, this is my son's father," some townsfolk ran with the incest story and it spread like wildfire. So let me quickly explain the Victoria and Lawrence situation for you, just a little bit. 2 weeks after his wife passed away in 1918, Lawrence had started a brief romantic relationship with Victoria. Mind you, Victoria was about 13 years younger than him. He asked Andreas for permission to marry Victoria on the condition that Andreas completely stops to have relations with Victoria, but Andreas reportedly replied, "We will see." This statement angered Lawrence so much, so that when Lawrence next saw Victoria after that conversation with her father, she then told him that she was pregnant with his child. He refused to accept the pregnancy because he was convinced that Andreas was really the father. 3 days after Joseph was born, Lawrence reported Victoria and her father to the authorities for incest, and once again, Andreas was taken into custody. Victoria begged Lawrence to withdraw his statement, offering to reimburse the child support he would be required to pay if he claimed paternity. Lawrence accepted the offer and the charges were dropped. That was why the initials LS was on Joseph's birth certificate. Lawrence was said to have maintained a polite, though tense relationship with Andreas and Victoria while gossiping and criticizing them around town. Now comes 1920 and the Gruber's family was thriving at HINTERKEIFEK. They grew crops, they raised animals, they had more than enough to sustain them at the time that the impact of the war was hard on the folks, and they were quite stable financially. So in November of 1920, the family decided that they needed to hire a maid to help with the chores within the household. Mind you, the family was made up of 5 individuals. At the time, there were 3 adults, being Andrea, Cecilia, and Victoria. Then there were Victoria's children, Zilly and Joseph. So they hired a 23-year-old maid called Crescent Rieger. When the maid arrived, she noticed that things were kind of like odd amongst the groupers. For instance, she had overheard Andreas tell his daughter Victoria that she was not allowed to remarry because as long as he was alive, she belonged to him. So this meant that the sacrilegious relationship between these two never ended for real. This old man was still abusing and controlling his daughter. That's what happens when authorities allows an abuser and a victim in the same space. Anyways, reports say that Andreas had once kept Victoria locked in a closet when a suitor arrived to ask for her hand in marriage. Then sometime in late 1921, almost a year after Crescent had started working with the Grubans, I think it was in October of that year, so she one day entered the barn unannounced because she didn't expect anyone to be in there, only to get the shock of her life. She in fact witnessed Andreas having carnal knowledge of his daughter Victoria. She saw them engage in the act for real. What she saw didn't sit well with her at all, and she did speak to Victoria about it. Victoria on her part explained that if she had known that Crescent was anywhere close by and was about to enter the barn, she wouldn't have surrendered to her father. I am guessing she must have been threatened or bullied into doing it. What a sick old man he was. What Crescent had seen tormented her so much she resigned soon afterwards and left the property, and the family began searching for a replacement almost immediately. Just a couple of months later, in the following year of 1922, precisely in March of that year, strange things started happening at HINTERKEIFEK. There were a series of abnormal and unexplainable events that happened, like the set of house keys that had gone missing, just like that. They looked for it everywhere, even though they had a particular spot where they usually kept the keys, but they didn't see it. This doesn't seem to be serious, right? Well, how about a Munich-based newspaper that was then found on the property, where no single individual or household in the area had ever subscribed to it or even traveled towards Munich? Andreas on his part tried to figure out what was going on. He questioned the postman, but the postman said he knew nothing about the newspaper and he had no idea how it had gotten there from Munich. Now, one Thursday morning of March the 30th, Andreas wakes up early and he notices the padlock on the engine room door was broken. It wasn't like that the night before when they had gone to bed. So he looks around to see if anything had been stolen, but nothing had been missing. But someone was surely in that room because clearly snow had been tracked from outside into the room. There was a set of footprints in the snow right there, headed from the woods at the rear end of the field to the HINTERKEIFEK property. But oddly enough, there was no track leading away from the property. How weird. So where was the owner of the footprint then? Andreas needed to get to the bottom of this because someone was messing with his family. So he went to his neighbor, Lorenz Schlittenbauer. Yes, the same Lorenz that they had issues with. And he explained to him that there was a break-in at his farm, but nothing was stolen. He also mentioned how there were footprints leading in, but not leading out. He told him about the missing keys and also the foreign newspaper that came from Munich. Mind you, Lorenz didn't exactly live right next door. Remember, this was rural Germany way back in the 1900s. Their own settlement was in Groban, quite a distance away from HINTERKEIFEK, even though they were the closest of neighbors. Well, Lorenz said he didn't see or hear anything out of the ordinary, but he advised Andreas to report to the local police, and advised that Andreas didn't agree to take. He also offered Andreas a revolver to protect his family, but Andreas said that he had his own guns, and even the offer to help search the HINTERKEIFEK property by Lorenz was turned down by Andreas, who said that he could handle things by himself. As he returned home later on in the day, Andreas noticed that the cows that he had left secured in the stables were now loose and they were left running around in the yard. No adult in the house knew who let the cows out. That day, Victoria had been out. She was looking for a new maid, so she wasn't even at home. And Cecilia didn't know who did it either. She was the only one at home, the only adult at home at the time, but she didn't know who let the animals out. So Victoria, while on the hunt for a new maid, visited a woman named Francisca to ask if her sister, 44-year-old Maria Bomgana, would be interested in taking the job as her maid. Maria was this deeply religious and introverted woman who had worked as a maid to keep body and soul together since her mother died in 1904. She was not an introvert by choice. Actually, it was because she was often discriminated upon due to her intellectual disability, and she also had a birth defect that made one of her legs to be a lot shorter than the other. Times were hard, and Francisca, seeing this as a good opportunity for her sister Maria, graciously accepted the offer on behalf of her older sister. So the agreement was made on the pay, and it was arranged that Maria would go to the HINTERKEIFEK farm the following day to resume work as a live-in maid. That very night, as the family retired to their beds to rest for the night, they heard muffled footsteps pacing up and down the attic. Everyone was scared. I mean, who or what could have been up there making that muffled sound in the attic? So Andreas, now in full protection mode, grabs a flashlight and goes to the attic to investigate what was going on, but he found nothing. What he saw was just straws scattered around the floor, but no one was there. But something or someone must have scattered the straw on the floor. So where was the person, or where was the thing? The following morning, which was Friday, the 31st of March, Zilly, who was now 7 years old, was sleeping all through school hours. She would fall asleep in class, and the teacher would wake her up, and then she would fall asleep again and they wake her up again. So the teacher asked her what was going on, what was wrong. She wanted to know if she was okay. So Zilly told the teacher that her family didn't get any sleep the night before because her mother, Victoria, had a fight with her grandpa, Andreas, and Victoria had run out into the woods, and most of the night was spent looking for her in the woods. Apparently, they thought something must have happened to Victoria. Maybe she had even drowned. But by daybreak, they found her sitting on a tree stump. I don't know where Zilly got this story from. She didn't even mention the thing that happened in the night, that's the noise in the attic. She just came up with this story. I don't know if it really happened. I couldn't find anything on it. Back home in HINTERKEIFEK, Andreas, after the event of the night before, was taking no chances. He did a walkthrough of the entire stretch of the farm, carried out thorough search of every nook and cranny of the farmhouse, but he couldn't find the source of the noises from the night before. At about 5 o'clock that afternoon, Maria, the new maid, arrived at the farm with her sister Francisca. They were received by Cecilia, who was the only adult at home at the time, along with her grandson Joseph. Zilly wasn't back from school yet, and Andreas was with Victoria in a nearby town. They had gone to run some errands, and it was said that while they were there, Andreas had mentioned the strange activities that were happening on his farm to a store clerk, and Victoria had also told a shop attendant that someone was trying so hard to break into their home. Surely these two must have been really worried about what was going on back in HINTERKEIFEK. As I was saying earlier, Cecilia received Maria and showed her to the maid's quarters. Her sister Francisca helped her to settle in, then she left for her own home. The next day, being Saturday, the 1st of April, HINTERKEIFEK was unusually quiet. Usually, every morning, each person would get up and carry out his or her own chores. They will be cooking, they will be feeding of the animals, but on this day, nothing of such activities happened on the farm. Zilly didn't show up at school, and just in case you were confused, yes, they went to school on Saturdays. At that time, classes were scheduled 6 days a week, including Saturdays. The rest of the family members were nowhere to be found. Not even the new maid was seen anywhere. The farm was empty, the house was locked up, there was no sign of human life anywhere. The only sounds on the property was coming from the animals in the stables. At this point, let me walk you through what the HINTERKEIFEK property looks like, the location and the farm and the description of the property itself. So this property is located approximately 70 kilometers north of the German city of Munich. It was a single-story building farmhouse shaped in the letter L. It was nested within a large farmland meadow, and pine forest. So the living quarters occupied the longer portion of the building, while the barn, stables, and engine room were at the other end. The property included a large crop farm and a well for water. There was a tool shed also on the property that was partly used as a bakery and a laundry room. It was pretty isolated. That's the spot where the building itself was pretty isolated. The closest neighbor, who were the Lorenz Schlittenbauer's family, lived about half a kilometer away, and the nearest village was a lot farther. The people who were supposed to be at home on that farm on that Saturday, April 1st of 1922, were 63 years old Andreas, his wife 72 years old Cecilia, the daughter 35 years old Victoria, 44-year-old Maria the new maid, 7-year-old little Cecilia, and 2-year-old Joseph. Saturday was supposed to be a busy day for them. It was the day when they took deliveries and attended to farms and did laundry and other stuff while Silly went to school. So that afternoon, two coffee merchants, Hans and Edward Shirovsky, came by HINTERKEIFEK to take an order, but they noticed that all of the doors on the property were locked. They knocked anyways on both windows and doors. There seemed to be no sign of life inside the house, but they could hear a dog barking from inside the stables. The cows were also quite restless and making loud sounds from the stables as well. So these two went up the road to a neighboring property and informed them that HINTERKEIFEK seemed to be deserted. Zillie's teacher in school noticed her absence as well, but she didn't think much about it because it was not unusual for her, given she hadn't been having sleep for some days according to her. So maybe she was asked to stay at home and rest for the day, or perhaps she hadn't been feeling well. So the teacher, alongside Zillie's classmates, said a prayer for her and proceeded without qualms. The next morning, being Sunday, two friends of the family waited by the front gate so Victoria would meet up with them so that they could walk to the Sunday Mass together. This was something that they did every Sunday, but Victoria didn't come out of the house that day. Time was running, so the two friends had no choice than to leave for church without Victoria. Fast forward to Monday, the postman arrived to deliver correspondence, but he saw no one on the property. He then took a peek through the kitchen window. Still, no one was there. At this point, other people passing by the farm were beginning to notice the family's absence. I mean, the farm was too quiet, unlike before. By Tuesday morning at about 9 a.m. on April the 4th, a mechanic, Albert Hofner, whom Andreas had scheduled an appointment with to repair a diesel engine, arrived at the property. Some reports say that it was the food chopper that he came to repair. Others say that he came to repair a diesel engine. Whatever it was, he had an appointment, so he showed up. So when he arrived on the property, he heard the cattle making sounds and the dog was barking from the stables, just like the coffee merchant had on the Saturday before. He went to the main door and knocked severally, but no one came to the door to answer it. The place was just quiet and lonely, but for the animals, so he assumed that perhaps the family had gone out, so he decided to wait a while in case they would return. But after about an hour, he thought, you know what, I'm just going to do what I came here to do, and when they get back, we'll figure it out. So he went to the engine room, and upon getting to the door, he noticed that the lock on the door was broken. He proceeded to carry the engine to the tool shed and then spent about 4.5 hours fixing it. As soon as he was done and double-checked that the engine was not working properly, he carried it across the courtyard towards the engine room. It was then that he noticed the door to the barn that was previously locked when he had initially arrived was now wide open, and the dog, which was barking from the stables initially, was now tied up by the front door, yet the house seemed empty. So he put the engine back in the engine room and walked away. At the back of his mind, he was thinking, why would whosoever had returned home not bother to talk to him if they had seen him working on their engine in the tool shed? So he passes by the Gruber's neighbor, Lauren's house, and tells him what he saw at the farm. So Lawrence, who had had this report before, feared that maybe something must have happened to the Grubers. So he sent his two sons, 16-year-old Johann and 9-year-old Joseph, to go and check. They arrived in HINTERKEIFEK at about 3:30 p.m., knocked, looked around, but there was no one. So they circled back and told their father what they had seen, that there was no sign of life on the HINTERKEIFEK property. Lawrence then decided to go to HINTERKEIFEK by himself to check on Andreas and his family. But before he left, he asked two of their other neighbors, Michael and Jacob, to just come along just in case there was any need for them. When they arrived, it was evening already, about 5 p.m. The entire house was locked up just like other people had said, except for the door leading to the engine room. That stillness was still there, except for the animals making frantic sounds in the stables. The men tried to open the door leading from inside of the engine room into the barn. It took a while because something was blocking the entryway from the other side. After some heavy pushing, they finally gained access. The barn was quite dark inside, so they had to use flashlight to see properly. Inside, the barn was in disarray because some animals had let loose from the stables and they were just roaming around. Michael was the first to notice something. He suddenly screamed, "There was a foot!" They looked to where he was pointing at, and for sure, there was a foot sticking out from behind a bale of hay. He pulls at the leg and the whole body moves to the open. It was the body of Andreas Gruber. He was dressed in his shirt and trousers. His face was covered in red vital body fluids and he had suffered significant head injuries. Jacob and Michael were overwhelmed with shock, so they went outside to kind of put themselves together while Lawrence stayed behind. Lawrence then went on to find 3 more bodies hidden under the straw. These were the bodies of Cecilia, Victoria, and little Zilly. Cecilia and Victoria were fully dressed, but Zilly wore only a nightwear. But all 3 had significant injury. Lawrence tried to move the bodies, and Jacob returned from outside and he requested that the authorities should be called first. Lawrence said that while they waited for the police, he would look for the other members of the family that were not in the barn. This would be his 2-year-old son Joseph and the maid Maria. So he went towards the adjoining stables. There he noticed a pickaxe leaning against the wall, but the pickaxe was clean, like it hadn't been used for a while. The family dog that was only a few hours ago seen by the mechanic tied up outside was now tied up inside. The dog had a wound above its right eye and it recoiled and trembled when the men approached it, showing it was afraid of them. The cattle were making frantic noise. They must have been really hungry because as soon as they were fed, they became very quiet. Then he continued to the door which connected the stables to the living quarters. The door was unlocked. He entered the kitchen and searched the house, finding Joseph's stroller in the bedroom with a woman's skirt draped over it. The skirt would later on be determined to be that of Victoria. So Lawrence pulled the skirt aside and saw the toddler inside the stroller. The sight was not pleasant at all to behold. The poor boy had been badly beaten on the head. Joseph's head had been shattered. Lawrence then moves over and unlocks the door to let Jacob and Michael into the living quarters. Jacob at this point asked him how he had gotten the key to open the door, and Lawrence told him that the key was left in the lock. Jacob at this point was kind of like suspicious of Lawrence, mainly because of the way he was calm and unfazed despite the horror that they had just discovered. In the maid's quarters, the mattress has been taken off the bed frame and then placed on the floor. 2 feet were poking out from under the duvet. Lawrence removed the duvet and laying there, deceased, was Maria, the new maid. Jacob and Michael, after the discovery of the bodies, rushed to the nearby village of Groban to let people know about what had happened at HINTERKEIFEK. Lawrence asked one of his sons to go straight to the local mayor and bring the mayor up to speed about what had happened to the Gruber's family, while he stayed behind to look after livestock and secure the farmstead. I wonder how he was comfortable staying alone at a place where there were so many bodies. when they were not even sure if the perpetrator was still around somewhere. Anyway, Lawrence's son got to the mayor, and the mayor in turn quickly informed the authorities, and a call was made to the police chief. Just like they say, bad news traveled so fast, the news of what happened to the Grubers spread around very, very fast. Because just about an hour later, about 6 p.m. I think, since the group that found the bodies had arrived around 5 p.m., a crowd had gathered at HINTERKEIFEK. Everyone wanted to see things for themselves. Mind you, the police had not yet arrived at this time, so it was just spectators on the site. Lawrence, for whatever reasons, thought it was wise to escort spectators through the property. Basically, he was giving them a tour of the crime scene and telling them what he had seen and what he knew. One neighbor was said to have cautioned Lawrence, telling him that it was wrong to take people through the crime scene when the police were yet to arrive. This neighbor told him not to allow anyone else into the crime scene so it doesn't get contaminated, but Lawrence replied that they were already there and there was nothing he could do about it. So he did nothing, and more people came in and out, and they walked through the building, checking out rooms where the bodies were, and a guest even reportedly stopped by the kitchen to fix themselves a snack. So when news got to the police in Munich, 5 investigators were sent out, and they took 2 tracker dogs with them to help out, but they didn't arrive on time. I don't know what means of transportation they were using at the time, but the journey was quite slow, so much that they arrived at the village at about 1:30 a.m. and by that time it was too dark for them to do anything. So they proceeded to the mayor's home and rested for a bit. At about 5:30 a.m. the following morning, the investigators arrived in HINTERKEIFEK from the mayor's home to commence their investigations. Upon arrival, they met Lawrence still at the farm. He said he was only there to keep watch over the farm. The lead investigator, Detective George Gruber, was the first to enter into the barn that morning. Everything was still as it was when the body were discovered and pulled out from under the hay. Cecilia and Victoria's body were over there beyond the threshold, while Andreas and Cilly's were still by the wall where Lawrence had left them. Like I said earlier, all 4 victims had sustained fatal blows to the skull, which was the obvious COD, but surprisingly, there was no red vital body fluid anywhere. The only place anything like that was found was on the door that led to the stable, so it didn't quite add up immediately. Considering the extent of the injuries, one would expect to see a full-blown crime scene with splatters everywhere. Well, the investigation continued, and Detective George inspected the pickaxe. Remember, I had said that the pickaxe was clean, so they couldn't really say if that was the actual weapon used. By just merely looking at it, and they couldn't determine if that was the weapon of choice of the perpetrator. However, he took samples of the red-brown spots that were found on the pickaxe handle so that it could be tested. Lawrence told the detective that he thinks that the pickaxe was the weapon used and that the cattle may have licked it clean because they were hungry. I don't know if he was asked to give this information or if he just volunteered it as his own opinion. But Detective George and his team of investigators proceeded into the kitchen, where they noticed some red spots, not much though, on the threshold leading to the maid's room where Maria was. Inside, they saw Maria still in a fetal position, how she had been seen earlier. What they concluded was that it seemed like she had been attacked as she was preparing for bed. From there, they proceeded to the family's bedroom, following some small red stains in the hallway leading to the rooms, but that was all that was there. Small red stains. There were no pool of red stains, no obvious footprints like they thought they would see. Now, on getting to the room where Victoria and her 2 children, Cilly and Joseph, slept, they noticed that the room was in disarray. It had in fact been ransacked. The cupboard and the wardrobe doors were wide open. There was an empty purse that belonged to Victoria just tossed on the bed. There were papers, a notebook, and a watch that seemed like someone just flung them across the bed. Apart from this No other room in the place, that's in the entire house, was disturbed. It pretty much didn't look like robbery or burglary was the motive here. So there was an attic in the barn. In there, investigators noticed hay had been spread across the floor. There was impression on the hay like someone or some persons had thrown them there and used the place to lay down. Then by the corner of the attic, excreta like human waste and bacon rings were found there, just by the corner. I'm not sure if any of these were collected for testing. If it was in present day, I'm sure they'll be collected for testing, but that was then in the 1900s. Well, it didn't end there. So they found some loose tiles on the roof, and these tiles could easily be raised slightly to view the living quarters and the entire yard outside. Whoever had been staying up there, he was definitely surveying the entire property. One puzzling thing about this entire scenario was that the external doors to the property had been locked from the inside, so investigators were kind of like confused how the perpetrator, whoever it was, managed to exit the building without being seen when the door were locked from inside. The 2 police dogs that had been sent along with the investigators from Munich were then let loose and sent out into the woods to maybe track down evidence. I'm not sure what type of dogs they were or what breed they were or what they were trained to do exactly, but they were sent into the woods and they came back finding nothing. Statements were taken from the locals and they interrogated traveling craftsmen, drifters and several people, everyone residing around the property or in the surrounding villages, including the first group of men who had discovered the crime scene. That would be Lawrence and his 2 sons, Jacob and Michael. When they questioned Lawrence, he insisted he hadn't let anyone on the property after finding the bodies, but I had earlier said that he was giving the tour of the property, so we know that he lied here. Many people in the statement had also told the police that Lawrence was letting people to see the crime scene, so for him to just lie about it like that, well, it was his choice. Lawrence further told the police that the family had 100,000 marks in cash stashed somewhere on the property. I'm not sure how it came about this information, but investigators could not find that money. They could only find 5-mark bill in a prayer book. So even though robbery now became the suspected motive after the mention of the 1,000 marks, the inability to find this money on the property made it difficult to support that theory. Also, too many valuables in the home were left untouched. There were jewelry, watches, more than 2,200 marks worth of gold and silver coins in the house, but they were all left behind, so robbery was ruled out. So now the police needed to put things together. They needed to put a timeline for when things had happened. So they started with the day Celie had missed school. That was on Saturday, April the 1st, and piecing things together, that's the testimonies of everyone who had at some point come on the property, like the coffee merchants, the 2 people who had waited for Victoria to go with them to church. They estimated that the crime had been committed between 8 p.m. and 11 p.m. on Friday, March the 31st. And on how the other persons in the household could not hear the other person scream when they were being attacked, an experiment was conducted inside the van, and it was concluded that one could not be heard even if they were screaming at the top of their lungs while inside the van. The passage that connected the main house to the van was quite narrow. The door was small as well. As such, only one individual, one person at a time, would have been able to pass through from the house into the van. It seemed like the family members were lured one after the other into the van through this narrow passage. It's unlikely that the entire family was harmed all at once. That would have been too much for one perpetrator to handle. Even if there had been more perpetrators, some family members would have put up a fight, especially Andreas Gruber. It wasn't clear what was used to lure the victims into the van, but some speculated an animal must have been let loose to cause a bit of distraction. Investigators were not even sure the order in which the family members were taken out, given that Lawrence had moved some of the bodies at the time that he had found them, so they didn't know who came first, if Andreas was first lured and harmed, or if it was Victoria or Cecilia. But going by what they could see, police suspected that Victoria and Cecilia were the first victims as they were both fully dressed, then followed by Andreas, who was in the process of changing into his nightclothes, then little Zilly, who was already in her nightwear and maybe had already gone to bed. After finishing his horrendous act in the van, whoever this perpetrator was, he entered the living quarters and struck Maria from behind while she was getting ready for bed before he attacked little Joseph. It was said that whoever this person was, whoever was responsible for this despicable act, had possibly even remained on the property after the fact for several days, feeding the animals and feeding themselves and just taking care of the farm. This was backed up by the fact that the family's entire bread supply and several pieces of smoked meat were missing. Also, witnesses had pointed out that the animals at HINTERKEIFEK were very quiet following the incident. That is going by the timeline that the police had given. This is the point where I would say that the investigation into the case was not handled properly from the start. Understandably, this was way back in 1922. First of all, that whole walking through the crime scene after the bodies were found and moving things around the crime scene was kind of like destructive, and this must have messed with forensic evidence. Then there was absolutely no fingerprints collected at any point in time in the course of the investigations. Mind you, collecting of fingerprints had been established more than 10 years prior to this incident. Then only about 5 photographs were taken of the crime scene. Yes, you heard right, only 5 pictures or thereabout of the entire crime scene was taken. The mechanic who had been on the property was never questioned by the authorities, and as for the autopsies, they were conducted on the grounds of HINTERKEIFEK right there in the yard to the full glare of the crowd of onlookers. So this was what happened. A door was placed across 2 wooden thresholds to function as a makeshift table. Then one by one, each body was dissected and examined by the district court physician. His name was Johann Baptist Amuller, who after the autopsy confirmed that all 6 victims had passed away from head injuries from blunt edge of an object such as a pickaxe. He also stated that the perpetrator was left-handed, as majority of the wounds were inflicted on the victims from the right-hand side of their heads. I'm not sure if this information was put into consideration when they were looking for suspect, but that would have been a very vital information, right? So Victoria was said to have sustained the most injuries. It appeared that she must have been strangled as well, because there were markings on her neck that were consistent with this. The marks on Victoria's neck pointed to the fact that the attack might have been as a result of a personal grudge. Some people speculated that the perpetrator could have been a scorned lover. There was also about a 9-star shaped wound on Victoria's skull. When it comes to the other members of the household, 7-year-old Zilly was the only victim who was said to not have passed instantly. She was said to have suffered for about 2 to 3 hours. She had torn out her hair in tubs while she was laying there in the straw before she eventually passed from her injuries. After the autopsy, the heads of all 6 victims were now sent to Pathology Institute at the University of Munich for further examination, and their bodies remain at HINTERKEIFEK awaiting burial. Now, when the bodies were being returned to the van to await burial after the autopsy, the 2 officials who were carrying Silly's body inside the van noticed a rope hanging down from the loft above the van. This rope hadn't been there earlier. No one had noticed this rope before. So they decided to investigate what this rope was doing there. They wondered where it was coming from, so they climbed up the loft. Lo and behold, there was a beam to which this rope was tied, and there were handprints on the dusty beam. The police dogs were again dispatched in an attempt to find out whoever had been hiding out above this place, because apparently whoever was there had been hiding there the whole time people were there on the property, but no trace of the individual was ever found. When it was time for the victims to be buried, the funerals were to be on Saturday, April the 8th, but on the 7th, lots and lots of sympathizers flocked into the area. Some even went to the HINTERKEIFEK property to get a glimpse of the site for themselves. but by then the police had already cordoned off the area and people were no longer allowed to go in. So on the morning of April the 8th, about 3,000 mourners came into the local Catholic church. Then the coffins were carried into the church on a wagon and a service was held, after which the 5 members of the Gruber family and Maria were then buried in a mass grave with the adults' coffins flanking the children's caskets. The police were struggling to solve this case due to lack of leads and evidence, so they announced a reward of 100,000 marks for information about the case. Anyone who knew the perpetrator or who could identify anything that would lead to the arrest of the perpetrator was urged to come forward, but no one did. So the amount was again increased to 500,000 marks. Still, no one came forward to claim the money. Posters were printed and distributed throughout the area, extending to Munich and beyond, just to create awareness and to publicize the investigation. The case made newspaper headlines across the country, and it left people scared, and everyone was now a suspect to the other person. Now, as the investigation proceeded, the Reverend Father who had officiated the funerals for the judge told the police that before all of this had happened, he had gotten an anonymous donation of 700 gold marks, and that was in his church, and he immediately suspected that the donation must have come from Victoria. So he requested her presence after church one day, and he asked her about it, and she reluctantly admitted that she was the person who made the 700 gold marks donation. Then a local carpenter, Michael, came forward to say that on Saturday, April the 1st, he had walked past HINTERKEIFEK property at about 11:30 p.m. at night. Now, if you had been following the timeline of events, you would have noticed that by this time the family had already been wiped out. So the carpenter said he saw a light shining inside the farmstead and smoke was coming from the chimney. So that means someone must have been cooking something, right? But the smell that was emanating from the smoke was horrible. Then he noticed a figure holding a flashlight going up and down the yard. As he stood contemplating whether to check out what the disgusting smell was about, the figure began to approach him, shining the light in his eyes. That scared him a bit, so he hurried along, never looking back. So he didn't get to see who it was that was charging at him. I'm not sure if his claims was investigated. At least the oven should have been checked out to see what might have been burning and causing that kind of awful smell that he was complaining about. Then a farmer and butcher, Simon Rainblind, I'm hoping I'm pronouncing this right, the butcher, Simon, said that on the same April the 1st at 3 a.m. while he was on his way home near Brunnen, he saw 2 unknown figures at the edge of the forest. When the strangers saw him, they turned around so that their faces could not be seen, and later on when he heard of what had happened at HINTERKEIFEK, he assumed that it's possible that the strangers might have had something to do with it. No one knew or understood the circumstances surrounding this heinous act. Some people speculated that this was a form of retribution for Andreas and Victoria's incestuous relationship, while others thought that there could have been political motivations behind this, mostly because it was theorized that Andreas belonged to one paramilitary organization or extremist group that was quite common in the region at the time, and he had either embezzled funds or committed treason. So the police decided that they would look at the case from this angle, and they started looking for an individual whom they knew was associated with such extremist group, and this was 33-year-old former soldier Adolf Gump. After World War I, Gump joined the Bavarian paramilitary faction, and eventually he formed a commando unit within the group in 1921. He himself admitted that he had participated in the massacre of 9 farmers, and somehow rumors had gone around saying that Adolf Gump was romantically involved with Victoria. This whole romance story remains unsubstantiated because Adolf Gump could not be found. Some weeks into the investigation, I think it was about 3 weeks or so, the police in Munich received a letter asking them to look into Karl Gabriel, that's Victoria's late husband. You see, Karl had reportedly passed away in action during the war 8 years earlier in France, but his body was never returned to Germany for burial like others. And there were stories of soldiers who faked their own demise just to leave the war front and live normal lives under assumed identities. So it was theorized that Karl might have done the same thing, and that when he learned of the incestuous relationship between Victoria, his wife, and Andreas, he had returned to Hinterkaifeck to take out the entire family. The police will look into this as well. They spoke with several of Karl's fellow officers who confirmed that they had seen his body after he passed away, and that his body was never returned home to Germany because he was buried in a war cemetery in France. Karl's family was not left out of the suspicion as well. People speculated that they carried out the crime for financial gain or for revenge for the way Andreas treated Karl while he was married to Victoria. Then there were also these two brothers, Karl and Anton Bichler, whom the locals pointed accusing fingers at. So these two brothers were well-known thieves who would work with Andreas at Hinterkaifeck during the potato harvest seasons. One witness claimed that Karl Bichler had come to him with the idea of robbing Hinterkaifeck, which he turned down. Then another local said that he had noticed that the brothers had been spending a significant amount of money after the crimes, despite having no jobs. Remember Hinterkaifeck's former maid, Crescens? She also came forward to say that the brothers were familiar with the layout of the property, and she thought that they did it together with George Sigel. George Sigel was someone who had worked at Hinterkaifeck, and he knew of the family's fortune. Supposedly, George had broken into the home before, sometime in November of 1920, and had stolen a number of items. This George denied anyways. Crescens insisted that Anton was one of the few people whom the family dog would never back at. She said that Anton had once remarked that the family needed to be wiped out, and when she heard this, she informed Andreas and Cecilia of this comment, but they dismissed the threat, and this also contributed to her decision to quit her job and leave the property, as she feared that the brothers were actually planning an attack on Hinterkaifeck. Upon hearing this, the police took Karl Bichler in for questioning. He denied any of the allegations and was able to provide an alibi for himself and his brother Anton. Apparently, they had been drinking in a bar about 51 kilometers south of Hinterkaifeck at the time of the crime. Another man, Peter Weber, was named a suspect by Joseph Betts. The two knew each other from working together in the winter of 1919 and 1920 as laborers, and they shared a chamber together. So according to Betts, Weber spoke of a remote farm, Hinterkaifeck. Weber knew that only one old couple lived there, and their daughter and her two children. Betts would later on testify in a hearing that Weber had suggested taking out the old man to get the family's money. When Betts did not respond to the offer, Weber just stopped talking about it. While investigations were ongoing, relatives of both the Grubers and the Gabriels started fighting over ownership of Hinterkaifeck. This started a legal battle that was later on resolved out of court. So the issue was that 7-year-old Zilli was Karl Gabriel's child, and she was the last person to pass after the attack. That means that she had been the farm owner for a very brief period of time. The period which she struggled to stay alive, those 2 to 3 hours, she was the owner of Hinterkaifeck. The Gabriels believed that the possession of the property should pass to her grandparents from her father's side. Are you still with me? I'm hoping that you're understanding what I'm explaining. While the Gabriels will end up purchasing Hinterkaifeck from the Grubers family for, I think it was 3 million marks. Then in February of 1923, they decided that they didn't want to keep the building because of the sad memories, so the entire property was marked to be demolished. But before doing that, they got an artist to paint a watercolor picture of the property for memories. Now, as carpenters were dismantling the roof, bringing down the building materials one after the other, they noticed several loose floorboards in the attic next to the staircase. Curious, they took them off, and behold, there was a small nest of hay. Underneath this, they found a blood-stained mattock. A mattock is a hand tool commonly used for clearing small trees and shrubs. This particular one had a blunt horizontal axe head and a long body handle. It had previously belonged to Andreas Gruber. as neighbors recognized the distinctive screw protruding from the handle. That screw Andreas had fitted during repairs, and it also perfectly matched the star-shaped injuries that was on Victoria's skull. The police then declared that the mattock was actually the weapon used in the crime. Beside this mattock was also a small metal probe that was coated in dried red vital body fluids. This was not all. Demolishing this property was revealing more secrets. So days later, while cleaning out the barn, excavators found a penknife covered in red fluid close to where the bodies had been found. This knife was not there the first time that investigators had checked the barn out. So, maintaining that they had conducted a thorough search of the crime scene, investigators believed that the perpetrator had returned to the farm to hide the mattock and the knife once the heat of the investigation had calmed down. Again, no fingerprints were taken from this item, so they couldn't be tested later. Then, sometime in August of 1923, the mother of another set of brothers, Carl and Andreas Schreier, confessed to a neighbor that her sons were responsible for the crime. Just before we go on, let me just say here that there's so many Carls mentioned in this case, so just try not to mix them up. There's surname attached to every one of them. The Schreier brothers, Andreas and Carl, were then arrested, and a hearing took place the following month in September of that year, but nothing came up of that. Both men were released due to lack of evidence. There was also another suspect mentioned. He was a former soldier who was said to have escaped from a Bavarian mental health hospital the year prior before the crime. He was believed to have been responsible for multiple burglaries within the vicinity, but there was no evidence linking him to the HINTERKEIFEK farm, and his whereabouts remained unknown, so he wasn't available for questioning. Lorenz, the neighbor who discovered the bodies, was not spared as well. The umbrella of suspicion was casted on him. So, you see, Lorenz had resided in his own farmhouse in Groban his entire life. He also served as the village guard, collaborating with local council and acting as a spokesperson for the community. Perhaps this was the reason he was acting the way he was when he found the bodies. But because of the relationship he had with Victoria in the past and how remarkably calm he had been upon discovering the brutalized bodies of his neighbors, including his alleged son Joseph, a lot of people were looking at him sideways. Witnesses commented on his apparent eagerness to disrupt the crime scene by moving the bodies and showing people around. Detective George had also noted in his report that it should not be left unmentioned that the head of district, Lorenz, showed a somewhat excited behavior. He talks a lot and also makes himself otherwise important. He took care of everything and was also well acquainted with the domestic circumstances of the deceased family. I don't know exactly how this makes him a criminal, but George said what he said, and that was that. Then George also goes on to say in his report that there was no known motive for Lorenz to commit the crimes. Remember Jacob, the other neighbor who was also present when the bodies were found? He admitted that he had been suspicious of Lorenz right from the time he opened the farmstead door with the keys he claimed was already in the lock. Remember, Andreas had complained that the house key had been missing for days prior to the assault. Even though it is not clear if these were the same set of keys, what we know is that Jacob didn't hide his feelings. He made it quite known and clear that in his eyes, Lorenz was a suspect. This made Lorenz so mad, he even had to sue Jacob for defamation. He took out space in the local newspaper, warning anyone who spread rumors about him relating to the incident at HINTERKEIFEK. He said he would sue whether you were wealthy or not. He would just sue you if he said anything about him. I didn't know that suing and counter-suing was going on back then. It's quite interesting to know that all what is happening in the present day was also happening back then. Local teacher Hans Blager was said to have seen Lorenz visiting the remains of the demolished HINTERKEIFEK property in 1925. Upon being asked why he was there, Lorenz had allegedly stated that the perpetrators' attempt to bury the family's remains in the barn had been hindered by the frozen ground. This was seen as evidence that he had intimate knowledge of the conditions of the ground at the time of the crime. Maybe being a local, he must have been making an educated guess. Another speculation was that Lorenz might have attacked the family after Victoria demanded financial support for their son Joseph. I don't think this is true because they had already worked out their child support issues, so that wouldn't have been another reason why he should have attacked an entire family. 4 years down the line, Lawrence Clayton Bauer's home in Groban burned down, and many of Lawrence's important documents, including some related to Joseph's paternity, were destroyed. That same year, Detective George stepped down from the HINTERKEIFEK case, and a criminal inspector, Martin Reed Mayer, took over the case. In the middle of May 1927, a stranger was said to have stopped a resident of Weidhoven at midnight. He asked him questions about the crimes at HINTERKEIFEK and then shouted that he was the perpetrator before he ran into the woods. The stranger was never identified nor apprehended. Looks to me like it was just someone playing a prank. Fast forward to 1931. This was now 9 years after Inspector Reed Mayer reopened the case and re-interviewed key witnesses, including Lawrence, who was very sad about how he was treated as a suspect because of his good intentions. Nothing came up of this re-interviewing, nothing came up about this case under Reed Mayer. Lawrence later passed on in 1941, and his daughter Regina, in an interview in Modern Times, that's in recent times, she felt bad that her father and the family was treated poorly when her father was only trying to help. In 1932, an article in a German newspaper reflected on the lasting impact of the HINTERKEIFEK incident. Then in 1937, the two brothers of Victoria's deceased husband, Carl Gabriel, allegedly confessed to their maid of committing a crime. Allegedly, their motive was for monetary gain. Both men were arrested, but subsequently they were released without charge. 3 weeks later, after they had proved that they have purchased the HINTERKEIFEK estate with their own savings. By 1939, the investigation was set aside completely as the Second World War had started. Then sometime in the 1940s, bombings by Allied forces on German cities, including Munich, destroyed them. Then 6 years later, after the war came to an end, a journalist called Josepha had published some article in Bavarian newspaper about the case. As a result, several German prisoners of war came forward, and they said they were released prematurely from Soviet captivity by a Bavarian-speaking Soviet officer who claimed responsibility for the HINTERKEIFEK crimes. This now reignited the rumors that maybe Carl Gabriel was indeed alive and he must have carried out the crime, because some people testified that Gabriel had always wanted to go to Russia, but further investigations will reveal that these men were not credible, so again their own testimony was thrown out. In 1952, I think in May of that year, Adolf Gump was once again brought up as a perpetrator. This was because his sister had allegedly told a priest that Adolf had confessed before passing away that he had carried out the crime with his brother Anton. By this time, Adolf himself had been deceased for about 8 years. He had passed away in 1944, so only his brother Anton was arrested and questioned by a prosecutor. I think this prosecutor was a new one. His name was Andreas Popp, but 2 weeks later he was released, and he, Adolf, was eventually completely ruled out in 1954. The files were officially closed in 1955, but things kept coming up afterwards. So in 1971, Karl and Andreas Schreier, remember them, the two brothers who were briefly arrested in 1923, a woman called Teresa, claiming to be the daughter of their neighbor at the time, wrote a letter to the Attorney General saying that when she was about 12 years old, their mother, Mrs. Schreier, during one of her visits to her own mother, were talking about the visit that she admitted that her sons were responsible for the crimes, right? So she said that their mother had made a remark that Andreas regretted that he had lost his penknife. Remember, a penknife was found on the property. Mind you, that situation with the knife that was found when the house was being demolished was never made public. So how did they know that a penknife was missing? So the police invited this woman, they interviewed her, but there was no further evidence to support her claims. So yet again, it ended there. In 1978, a journalist called Peter published the first book on the crime. The title was HINTERKEIFEK, Germany's Most Mysterious Murder Case. The book was such a success that it sold out immediately. The second edition of this book later be published years later. Since then, there has been documentaries about this case, and a detective called Conrad Mueller continued looking into the case until his retirement in the 1990s. He collected a total of about 12 binders worth of evidence on the case, and in 2018, he gave these binders to the Bavarian Police Museum in the city of Ingolstadt. Mueller's documents will be with other displays of the museum's HINTERKEIFEK exhibit. I am not sure if you can still find them there, but well, he gave it to them and they were put together. In 2007, 15 students from a Bavarian police academy looked into the case to see if they could solve it using 21st century techniques. So according to them, the crime was personally motivated due to the manner in which the bodies had been concealed, and the marks on Victoria pointed to that fact as well. They concluded it wasn't possible to solve the crime due to the significant loss of documents, the lack of forensic evidence, and the key witness that had already passed away also contributed to their inability to solve the crime. They, however, did say that they had established a prime suspect, but out of respect for the surviving family members and descendants of this person, they would not mention any names. Up to date, no one knows for sure what happened that night at HINTERKEIFEK farm. It's been a lot of years, but the family had not forgotten. The land is still being used for agriculture, but no one lives there right now. Just a little shrine that marks the spot where once stood the farmhouse. So that is all I have for you today, my loves. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing to the channel. Until next time, I'll see you.